Presenting on this topic is going to be Barry DOWSETT from Sound Rangers. He's the co-founder of Sound Rangers. He's one of the original pioneers in the online delivery of production sound effects and music built for games and interactive media. He actively creates and maintains an online library of downloadable sound effects and music optimized and licensable for game development, available at soundrangers.com. As a veteran of the video game industry, Barry actively provides original music, sound design, voiceover, and integration services for many console and casual games. Recent titles have been completed for THQ, DreamWorks, iWin, Activision, Google, Electronic Arts, the list goes on. Give it up for Barry DOWSETT, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thanks, Aaron. Before we get started, do you guys down there want to come up here and participate? We're doing more of kind of a communal talk here as opposed to me talking at you for another 30 minutes. And our hope is to kind of get people from multiple facets of the industry involved and chatting with one another to find out, what works and what doesn't in terms of game development, whether you're a game developer or an audio developer, which I am. So I'll just give you a quick rundown of what I do. I do a lot of custom music and sound design for games and have done so since 1996. I also have a library of sound effects and music that we've developed over the years, more or less for game usage and all licensable to game developers. So the role I play when working with a game developer is I am hired as an outsourcing solution to come in and do sound and music for games. So I do all my production off-site. I am hireable to come on-site and work with a developer. I am also, from time to time, in charge of hiring people myself to help with the project and all that sort of stuff. So I see a lot of stuff. And one of the things that seems to be a reoccurring issue is at the beginning of a project, what I need from a developer and what the developer needs for me, and figuring out what we can do to hold hands, shake hands, and so forth, so that the game itself becomes a better product in the end. So I'll talk about a few things up here, and I'm hoping that we can inspire a conversation amongst ourselves so that we can determine maybe what each other's needs are and so forth. So how many people are audio developers? Everybody? Are there game developers out there? Couple? Okay. Film people? There's a few film people too? Okay. Okay, cool. So what I'll do is I'm just going to get started at the beginning of at the beginning of a project, and try and determine, and maybe ask you guys that are game developers what your opinions are on these things, and I'll tell you what my opinion is on these things, and then we can kind of figure out if there's some common themes and some stuff that really bugs you and bugs me, and figure out if we can come to a solution, and then let everybody out there that's listening in on the podcast know about this too, so we can build a better product and so forth. And the whole point is that through this discussion we can help build a better product. And as I was mentioning earlier, one of the things I've heard a lot of this conference, not so much in the last few years, but specifically this week, is that people are starting to pay more and more attention to music and sound in games, and specifically social stuff, which just seems to have been for a while kind of relegated to a 30-second loop and a couple of sound effects, and the music loop has a horrible gap in it because they're using MP3s, and it's they say they don't it's not a big deal, but usually when you're in a room, listening to a DVD and it skips, sooner or later somebody notices. So to me, that's unacceptable. And I think that we're getting to the quality bar now where we really need to raise the bar on stuff. So I'll begin with my slide, and I'll try and make this stuff quick. I could talk about any one of these for probably about an hour. So I'll run through this and then start asking you guys questions and so forth about how you feel about these things. So from a developer standpoint, do you guys have an opinion on what you like when you're starting a project? You know that you're going to need audio, and hopefully you determine that you need audio far before the beta ship cycle, which is occurring in a couple of days. What do you guys look for from a development standpoint? If you're looking to outsource, is it a reliability issue, experience? Do you need to know that people have tools, game titles, success, notoriety in the industry, such as Aaron has, all that sort of stuff? Can I ask you, do you guys, from a development standpoint, When you're looking to bring in an audio team, what are some things that you look for? What are some things that are tough? What are some things you think could be done better? And do you guys want to have any questions, or do you want me to just kind of roll through this? Not to put you on the spot or anything, but it's supposed to be a community roundtable. Otherwise, I'll just talk the whole time, which is no fun for you guys, probably. What's that? I'm surprised I still have one. I haven't stopped talking since Tuesday. Okay, let me start here. Because I'm hired a lot as an outsourcing solution, I'll just tell you what I'm told by developers as to why I'm hired and so forth, and also what I see in other people that makes an enormous amount of difference in the game development cycle. And some of that is reliability. I think that a combination of reliability and experience is really important to people. They need to know that from a professional standpoint, you can deliver stuff on time, because a lot of times developers are tied to milestones, which are tied to milestone payments from the publisher, et cetera. So if stuff's not being delivered on time, or it's not being delivered in a manner that's working for what they're asked to do, then you run into problems with, okay, well, we've delivered this thing, the audio's not right, or it's missing, people are delivering late. You start getting into all sorts of problems with kind of downstream from there, with people panicking at the last seconds and having to redo numerous revisions. The communication is really important. I myself try and communicate as much as possible. A lot of times these days, because of the technology, we're working with people from all over the world, not just locally. There's a lot of local game devs in Seattle, which is great for me because I can go have meetings on site and do all that sort of stuff. But a lot of the times, I'll be talking with somebody in the Ukraine over Skype, and they're on a timetable, I'm on a timetable, there's communication differences. All that stuff really takes time to work over, and you have to really make sure that you've got that communication pipeline in place so that everybody understands what the responsibilities and so forth are. I have spent a lot of time building up tools. We were having a discussion earlier about the cost of doing music and the cost of doing sound and all that sort of stuff. And one of the things that we talked about briefly is that in order to create quality stuff for your games, it's not a matter of just sitting down at a laptop in a coffee shop and tapping out some beats. It's really, I've spent my whole life getting to this point. I've spent an awful lot of money with sample libraries and professional tools, which are Pro Tools, and so forth, to be able to deliver to you guys stuff that is super high quality. And I don't think that can be said for some other tools out there. I think having the knowledge, the creative knowledge, having the technical knowledge to get all your computers working, the sample libraries to talk to one another, your sequencer to do this and do that and roll over and do all the things that we need to do to get this stuff sounding good. People know that I've got the technical ability and the creative ability to do what's needed. So I like to tell, part of my pitch when I'm doing a new gig and so forth is that I've got the tools that you need. I've got the right sample libraries. I'm not using stuff that's dated that's going to make your game sound dated and so forth. So once they know that, they can be assured that we're bringing top quality gear and so forth to the table. And another thing, at least that I've looked at, and I know that, just working with other audio developers who are maybe hiring composers outside, like I'll be hired as a sound designer, but they're bringing in, or the publisher's bringing in a composer, is the style and the body of work. So if the game is representing an environment that is indicative of a certain style of music, oftentimes the developers will look for somebody that's very well versed in that. I know that at times when there's styles of music that I don't do, I'll look for people that are really well versed in that sort of thing. So I'm assuming for some of you devs out there, maybe it's the same sort of thing where you're aware of people in the industry whose music that you like. And I don't know if you guys seek them out and try and hire them to do custom work or not, but generally having a style, body of work, reliability, having a basic bed of tools to get the job done are pretty important, I think, at being hired. And when I'm looking for other people to work with, I usually try and make sure they've got all that stuff under their belt. You guys have any questions? Please? No. No, don't.
Yeah. What would your biggest gripe be when somebody comes to you and asks for a particular piece of music, and how they go about describing it?
My biggest gripe, and I think that why don't we move that into our next set of items there, is not communicating what they want. And this happens all the time, is I'll be asked to, hey, we need some music for the game. That's what they ask me, and I'm like, okay, so yeah, I mean, it seems like a simple question, but people, I mean, I get that. It's like, you know, what kind of music do you need? And I'm like, well, okay, so at first, instead of asking them, you know, well, what kind of music are you looking for, I'll generally ask, what genre of game are you making? What are the characters like? What are the environments like? How is the music going to work with any middleware or any, you know, code features? Is it adaptive music? Is it just, you know, 5-second loops and all that sort of stuff? But through that, because sometimes the developer doesn't know, and they'll say, well, we want you to tell me what I should need. Sometimes they have very discrete ideas of what they want, but I generally, I'll ask some questions about the game, and then I'll ask some questions about reference, if you have reference of stuff that you like, that we can then not plagiarize, but, you know, do something in that same vein. So if it's a dark, atmospheric, spooky thing, you know, there's sometimes a palette of sounds that you can use that would be representative of that sort of environment. If you have reference material, you know, it's more of like, okay, references, you know, death metal, you know, with double kick and all that stuff, then we know that, you know, we can listen to the reference material and then do something that's kind of using that palette of sounds. But it really helps us to have a little bit of an idea of what you want, maybe some reference material. A playable build is always really helpful, all that stuff, so that we can kind of ascertain what road we need to go down, which then allows us to kind of get our pipelines together. Because if we know it's going to be like really high-end, frenetic, orchestral stuff, you know, for us as composers, we have to get the libraries up and going. You know, that is a much larger process than doing like sort of light atmospheric pads, which would be more synthesis as opposed to, you know, hiring organic players and so forth. So with all that said, entering into a conversation with you about all this sort of stuff is great, but when I just get shotgunned with an email with no information, but, you know, what kind of music are you looking for? It's pretty frustrating. And I have another great example, actually, and this happened a few years back, where we were doing some sound design, and the animators asked me if I had, they just said they needed some spider sounds. And you know, so again, like, okay, well, what, you know, does this spider, you know, does it tweet on my shoulder, or does it, like, you know, stomp around and inject poison into you? Does it roar? Is it hairy? Does it have horns? You know, what is it? Because I could go in any direction, and from a sound design standpoint, you know, I would need to have, you know, some artwork of it so I can at least see it. How big is it? Does it make, you know, because if it's large, it makes giant footstep sounds. If it's tiny, it may skittle around, and it's in a whole different sound design path that you go down. So usually like character head shots, you know, how it interacts in the game, if it's in the combat system, all that. What does it do? Is it, you know, is it a friend? Is it an enemy? Is it AI? How is it going to work? Which is another good point too, because from the code side, we need to know how a spider animation is going to come together. Is it just sort of a linear thing that you're going to need sounds for, or are there multiple, you know, is there an idle animation, a walk, a run, you know, a death animation, attacks, all that sort of stuff? We have to create sounds for each of those little animations and hope that at runtime it all gets stitched together via whatever code or middleware you're using. But for us, we have to know that to even begin having a conversation about it, because otherwise we're just shooting in the dark. have no idea where to begin. So we have to create, get the audio palette together to create the character, sort of the character of the spider, and then we take a look at the technical side and figure out, when we're building the sound, am I going to have to clip off little, chunks of stuff so the spider movement has a certain sound, the deaths have certain little, emotes that it make, but all that sort of information, as much stuff as you can give us is really fantastic. So my biggest gripe is when we're not given enough information to do the job that we want to, because then what comes back to you is spider sounds or music, and you're like, well, that's not even close to what I'm looking for. And then I have to say, well, I didn't know what you're looking for, so I gave it my best guess because I didn't have any art or build or any of that sort of stuff. I'm just guessing. And so then you get into doing multiple revisions, and then you get into figuring out, well, are the revisions part of the initial bid, or are we going to charge you for revisions? All of that can be eliminated through the proper communication of, from a creative side, this is what I need. From a technical side, this is what I need. And then all of a sudden we're handing stuff off to you, you plug it in the build, and it's great. It's running, and maybe, 1 or 2 revisions down the line, we polish it up, and it's all good. And then, everybody is happy. You're not kind of going into this slog of like, okay, where are we at with the stuff, especially when, as you guys all know, audio tends to get left to the last second, and there is no time to turn stuff around. So if there's no time to do revisions on stuff that we're not sure what we're doing in the first place, then you're in a little bit of trouble, and the game ships with sounds you're not happy with, or they're missing or broken or whatever, and nobody's having fun at that point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's spot on.
Oh, okay, okay.
That's the sort of answer I was after.
Okay. So just to go quickly on this stuff, and to kind of address what you're asking, what I look for at the beginning of a project is all of this, and I tend to ask all of this, and sometimes there isn't an answer. So sometimes there's a playable build, which is really fun for us to kind of go in, play through it, kind of get an idea of how exploration is going to work, depending on the type of game, how it's all going to work, and that really helps us to determine what needs to be done. The schedule is really important. So, because if we're working as like a contracting entity, we have to line up other gigs because that's how we make a living and so forth. So it's really important for us to have hard deadlines. And I know that a lot of that stuff slips, and there's stuff that gets thrown to the pipeline and changes and all that stuff that make the timeline really malleable. But it's really helpful for us to line stuff up if we have, if we know approximately when you guys are going to need stuff, and then we can adhere to milestones. We know when we're getting paid, when you need to pay us, and then we can move forward from there. And if stuff goes over, and a lot of times with console stuff, you're looking at a 6 or 8 or 10 month development cycle. You start getting to alpha and beta, and stuff starts slipping, audio's left to the last second, everybody's panicking, and then you start getting over, and then you run into problems with, having to book yourself on other projects, and if it's slipping into that, you have a little bit of a problem. The social stuff's not as bad because it's a quicker in and out and so forth. But just having a general milestone schedule is massively helpful. So if you're gonna come to us, and say, hey, what do you need? That's really a huge component of it. The other thing, which I think is really important, and I know I was talking to Aaron about this earlier too, is just openness to have some artistic freedom with whatever it is you're doing. I've kind of been on both ends. I've been on the creation end where, I've been asked to do. Some people say, hey, it's great no matter what you do. Some people are really super picky about it, and you do some revisions, which is great because in the end, I give it my best effort, and I hope that the first time around everybody likes it. You always have to make tweaks, so we're always prepared to make revisions and so forth. But there's been other situations where, and I'm just witnessing on this on the sidelines, where there's been a really compatible relationship between creative entity and entity at the development company, which is acting as sort of an overseer for the project. And so in this case, musically, there has to do a piece of music. The trumpet part is being played, or the whole piece of music needs to be a half step higher or lower. The trumpet patch that you pulled from this library is slightly too grating and needs to be ducked by 1.5 dB. All that super tweaky stuff tends to bog down the creative process. And so what I would kind of assess when looking at who I'm going to work with is whether I'm going to be given some artistic freedom, whether they're going to listen to what I'm saying, whether they're going to chisel me down into a point where I just, you know, it's just hard to get anything done at that point when there's no reason for that. I think a lot of times, and I used to make the same mistake in my earlier years, where you dig into something and you look at it too closely and you can't see the bigger picture and you get lost in it. And really, in the end, when you look back on it, it's fabulous. It's kind of like doing takes. You know, you do your first take and it's spontaneous and fabulous, and then you think about it for a few minutes and it's like, I can do that better. And 1,000 takes later, it isn't any better. And a year down the line, you're like, why did I ever do that? The first take was fantastic. So I try to figure out if it's, you know, if it's somebody that I can work with, that I feel like I can have a great relationship with. And I would say 99% of the time I have a great relationship with them. So that's that. So any questions before I change up the slides? Because I need to keep moving. Any audio questions from guys? Anybody that wants to bring anything up? Greg, Ron?
Well, you touched on this a little bit, but maybe you can get a little deeper with it. What happens and how do you handle it when a developer says, here's my sound list, and he's got 20 sounds, 30 sounds, whatever on there. A handful of them are UI sounds, you know, and then he's got listed as one sound, maybe it's a level up. And then when you see it in the build, it's actually a sequence of events that takes 3 or 4 seconds to unfold. That's really going to involve 7 or 8 sounds, all synchronized together.
Right. Well, what I would hope is that we get some sort of vid capture of that. So in terms of the reference stuff I was talking about earlier, when we're cost estimating everything and figuring out deliverables, timeline, how long it's going to take to do that sort of stuff, sometimes it's really easy to, you know, the developer might say, hey, you know, I need this, you know, animated sequence. And it's like, okay, great, well, that's just one animated sequence. And then you're told later that the code people are, you know, when the object flies in and then it does this and walks away and jumps and all that, you know, at first I'm told this is one linear sequence, and then we find out later that it's actually 5 different sounds that are chopped together and played back in code. The reason being is that, you know, with a lot of the web-based games and stuff, there's different machines running at different speeds, and so the synchronization, so with Flash stuff, you get into this problem where if your machine's running slow, you've got a bad connection, stuff can get out of sync, so that's why you know, chop stuff up so that it can remain in sync. But I don't have a really clear answer other than I have to go back and discuss with, especially if we've estimated it out on a per sound deal, I have to go back and discuss with the developer, okay, this is actually 5 different sounds. Because I didn't get the right information up front, I now have to charge you more for it. And that's always, I mean, generally it works okay, but it's a little bit of an awkward conversation. And so again, like when I'm assessing a project, I try to really find out, you know, if we're talking synchronized sound design, how many elements within that real synchronized piece or am I going to need to chop up, or really 5 different sets of sounds. And so that kind of goes back to, you know, that should be communicated up front to us, because otherwise you have this kind of back end thing that you're like, you know, I'm spending a lot of time on it, we need to be compensated for it. And there's a lot of different levels of game developers. Some know this. If you're working with an audio director, they're always going to know that, and they'll probably more often than not deliver you exactly what you need. Some indie guys don't necessarily know the process, so I try and work with people to just kind of educate them a little bit about what we need, so those sorts of issues don't come up.
Thanks.
Yeah. So in terms of what gets communicated to us at the beginning of a project, again, all of what I've been talking about is a little bit here on this particular slide, but the communication stuff is always really important for us at the beginning of the project. So what I usually ask for at the beginning of the project is all of what I've just been talking about, plus asset lists if you have them. If you know approximately how many sounds they're going to be, you may not have all the hooks in, but you can at least give us an idea of what it's going to be, the types of sounds. UI sounds are often different from combat sounds, which are different from environmental background stuff, which of course are different from music and so forth. So if you have an asset list that has all this stuff documented, that's really fabulous, because then I can really look at it and assess what needs to be happening and then give you a pretty accurate estimate. Schedule is always important too, because I need to know when stuff's going to be delivered and get it into my pipeline and get everybody assigned to it. The schedule is usually based on the project scope, so if you think it's going to be a quick in and out, that's great. If it's going to be something that's going to take up 8 months, then I have to be cognizant of the fact that it's probably, when I'm off the project, it's probably going to be 3 months after when they say the project is going to be done. I've never worked on a project in 15 years that hasn't slipped. So it's pretty, what's that? Okay. So I'm usually there's a little red flag that goes up, so I try and, cost estimate. Okay, I know it's going to slip, so I'm going to have to ask for a little bit more money just to cover my costs and so forth. Music, it's not as big of a deal because you're usually you're doing it on a per minute thing, and you kind of know up front how many minutes are going to be, and unless the scope slips where they've added more mini games or more gameplay or whatever, it's usually pretty locked in. It's nice to know what my responsibilities are. Doing sound and music is really kind of crossing over into integration these days. I see people that are doing only sound design and music or only integration. I don't think proper game audio can be done like that. I think that as a sound designer, you absolutely need to know about implementation, and I think you have to know everything about Foley and sound design to be able to properly implement and so forth. The problem is that oftentimes, like, we'll make some sound, we'll make some music, and then somehow we're suddenly finding ourselves doing integration. And I have to always be very, very, very clear about if we're doing integration or not, because to us, the integration is an increasingly larger component of doing game audio, and it eats up a lot of time. So I have to be, I usually scope that out and say, if we're going to start doing scripting or FMOD or whatever, then that's an additional component that we need to charge for. But I need to know that that's happening too at the beginning of the project. I can hear you.
Is there a difference between integration and implementation?
You know what? It's always been implementation for me, and I notice that the social crowd uses integration, and I'm sure there'll be another genre of the game development community that comes up with something different, but they're the same term. Am I mixing my terms up? I am a little bit. I'm just used to using one, but I'm trying to make it easier for you guys to understand. So, okay, moving on really quickly. Revision expectations, that always comes up. If we do 50 sounds, how many revisions do you guys get out of it? So you can discuss that, talk about it. Again, if I don't have a lot of stuff up front, I'm probably not going to want to do a ton of revisions because I wasn't given the proper material to begin with. If we have a lot of stuff up front and great communication, we can usually get revisions done really cleanly, but it's definitely something to bring up, with the audio developer and communicate about it. Okay, go ahead. Because if you don't, then all of a sudden you may be asked to do a revision of music 15 times and you weren't expecting it, and all of a sudden it's another conversation that has to be had.
Maybe you could define what qualifies as a revision and what doesn't qualify as a revision.
Well, if let's say you start on a piece of music and it's good, but there's some issues with it. Maybe the music has too much movement in it, and it's conflicting with the sound design bed that's creating the environment, and you need to go back and just remove some of the mid to high frequency woodwind stuff or whatever, because there's birds chirping and this and that, and they're all operating at the same frequency. Then I would go back in and maybe eliminate that stuff and build it around what the ambient soundscape is. Or maybe from a sound design standpoint, you're building some combat stuff that needs a little bit more low end, needs to be bigger, maybe a few more revisions. So that sort of stuff is generally, I would consider that part of the process. The revisions that get tricky are when you start with orchestral and you end with Norwegian death metal, because that's a whole change up of gears. They're not really related, and that at that point it's usually, you know, you need to kind of, I would consider that a scope change. So, you know, usually if you listen to some references, you've discussed all this stuff, and you're going to head down this path in terms of music because you've got reference and you've discussed these things. But if suddenly you decide, oh, that doesn't work, let's do this, then that's when you have to have another conversation, because that's starting from ground zero again instead of polishing what you've already done. So the revisions, I always look more or less look at it as polishing stuff. The change to scope would be heading down a completely different path that you didn't discuss in the first place. Again, I've kind of mixed these up a little bit. The game developer, what's expected from you guys is I need a schedule, asset lists, communication, art, headshots, line count, all that stuff. I didn't even get into voiceover, but we'll leave that for next year. Hamburg, hopefully. Okay, good, Jeff.
I'm just wondering how much of this stuff gets communicated in a contract? Or, I mean, obviously there's a conversation, but at what point do you sort of solidify it in a contract?
Okay, so in the contract, what gets solidified is always milestone, because these things are going to be delivered on this date and you get paid this much money. So that's in there for sure. Generally, you talk about how many minutes of music. You know, for social stuff, you might have 1 minute or 8 minutes or 10 minutes, console, 50, 60 minutes, whatever. That's usually written in. So you may have a budget for 8 minutes of music. You put that into the contract. If it exceeds that, then you go back and that's kind of, I always consider that sort of a new work order. And it's never really a problem there, because sometimes, you know, the developer want to add stuff in, and they're aware that it's going to cost a little bit more money. So you usually stipulate that sort of stuff. The sound effects are a little trickier. For the larger projects, it's really hard to itemize all that stuff. So what goes into the contract is basically you're working for hire. You're expected to do all of the sound design for the project until the end for this amount of money. It's never done per sound effect because there's too many sound effects to really do it that way. The smaller social stuff, you can kind of quantize it a little bit more. So maybe it's 150 sound effects for this amount of money. If it goes over that, you know, then you can discuss it a little bit more. But I would try and put as much detail into it as possible. I think and something actually I wanted to ask as well is whether the ASCAP, the PRO component, needs to be put into the contracts these days, because I've never done it because I was never aware that that was sort of on your guys' radar. But what I'm being told is that you should probably always put the, you know, considering the Facebook.
Yeah, it's optimal to have it in there.
Okay.
If it's not stated that you don't specifically have the right to receive the, if it's not stated that you don't have those rights,
okay,
then it can be implied that you do.
Okay.
But the ideal thing is to say, and I reserve my rights to receive my writer's share of the royalties.
Okay. So
yeah.
I think that's probably absolutely something that should go in, and whether, I mean, in the case of composers who are also on their own publishing company, do you try and is that a negotiable point, or do you discuss that with the developer as to who's really acting as the publishing entity?
Well, if they don't have a lot of money to offer you up front, then you could just say, look, I'm going to basically own all the music and give you a synchronization license to use all my music in the game, but
okay,
for any other ancillary use, I'm going to be the owner of it.
Okay.
I mean, that's up to them, but usually it's a work for hire in which they insist that they own all the music.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's great. So yeah, definitely put that stuff in there. In terms of, and that's also a great way to, time to go? Okay, I'll just finish up here. A great way to basically paint an outline around what your responsibilities are. And most of the time your responsibilities should probably stick to what you're contractually obligated to do. I need to go. During the project, a lot of this is sort of all kind of on the same. I've talked a lot about a lot of things here that'll all wrap into one another. So are there any last minute questions that we can answer? Or do we really need to get to go? All right. All right, thanks. All right, that's it. All right. You guys just check out the PowerPoint later and we can talk about it. Thanks for coming.